Along with all this flying, I had a love life, starting in 1939 with Mary Caroline Ellis. A few weeks after I landed in the Canal Zone, my personal effects arrived from Langley Field, including my car. I dressed up in a new U.S. Army Air Corps white uniform made for social activities in the tropics, and the time came for me to broaden my horizons. I went cruising that evening and spotted 18-year-old Caroline at a social gathering with a mutual friend. I moved in for an introduction. I found myself dancing with the friendliest, prettiest girl I had ever met. She was the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Daniel M. Ellis, second in command of the 5th Infantry Regiment, a unit new in the Canal Zone digging itself a base in the nearby jungle. Caroline and the Army Air Corps. Caroline Ellis was a Panamanian princess, one of 5 finalists in the Panama Canal Zone beauty contest, a well-deserved royal title. Dancing with her was fun, so I made a date with her for a Tuesday in 2 weeks' time, the earliest I could get a date. Others had booked her up. Human frailties being what they are, I blew that perfect beginning. Come Wednesday 2 weeks, I had missed that date. I plain forgot. Immediately, I wrote a reasonably vague note of apology and dispatched it with a box of candy. Her reply came whistling back, unsatisfactory. A proper explanation would be better than 6 boxes of candy. I bought 5 more boxes of candy, and delivered them with as much charm as I could muster. Although Caroline was still miffed with me, her father got a big laugh out of it and suggested she accept another date with me so I could come over and eat the cheap candy I had bought. Our social activity in the Canal Zone revolved around the Officers' Club. Albrook Fields Club was a poor place to bring a new girlfriend. It was polluted with 20 to 30 bachelor lieutenants fresh from the States. Given the scarcity of appropriate places to go in the evenings at the Canal Zone, I had no choice but to take her to the Saturday evening dances. Thereafter, my social life with Caroline had to conform to the impact of surplus suitors. Finally, I had enough dates with her to convince her she loved me and that we should get married. Maybe it was because I was more impressive as a new first lieutenant and the new CO of the 29th Fighter Squadron, 16th Fighter Group. Or maybe not. A lieutenant is a lieutenant except when that rank precedes colonel or general. I received permission from Colonel Ellis to marry his daughter, and I wasn't waiting around for anyone to change his or her mind. Caroline and I were to be married in 2 weeks. It just so happened that the 1941 Canal Zone Baseball Championship was about to be played. Colonel Ellis was very proud of his 5th Infantry team. So as time and banter would have it, a bet ensued. He bet that if his team won, would pay all the expenses of the wedding; if his team lost, he would pay the groom's wedding expenses as well as his own. I pitched and my team won. I married Mary Caroline Ellis on April 26, 1941 at Albrook Field in the Canal Zone at the Episcopal Church, St. Luke's Cathedral, all expenses paid. Much to her chagrin, I often claimed that I won Caroline in a baseball game, which is not entirely true, of course, but pretty close. Of interest, after being married for a couple of months, I learned Colonel Dan Ellis' history. As a young man, he walked out of a dirt floor cabin and down the mountains of East Tennessee one day and joined the Army as a horse holder. He fought in World War I, and then retired as a lieutenant colonel in the Army in 1943. He could play a mean fiddle and preferred goat's cheese. I always called him Colonel, never in later years, Dan, out of absolute respect for him. About the time Caroline and I got married, Panama got the attention of our nervous headquarters, and P-40 fighter aircraft were assigned to defend the Canal Zone. These were the first new combat airplanes in the U.S. My 29th Squadron was scheduled to be one of the first to get the P-40s, so I was ordered to pick up a flight of 9 new P-40Es in Ohio and bring them to Panama. As it later turned out, my 9 P-40s were rated combat ready and placed on General Alert on December 7, 1941. The infamous day the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The assignment to lead P-40s from Ohio to Panama was of such magnitude that it prevailed over plans for a honeymoon. That, as I discovered, is a poor way to start a life of matrimony. It was a long-term blessing that I married an army brat and was not the one who introduced her to our lifestyle. Buzzing my hometown. I picked up a flight of P-40s from Wright Airfield near Dayton, Ohio, checked out in the aircraft, and led them back to Panama. This trip through Central America would stay on schedule, taking a matter of hours. It was a far cry from our trip 2 years earlier flying P-36s. But it just so happened that my hometown Waverly was directly below one leg of that flight plan, and I was flying the newest, hottest fighter airplane in service. The situation overwhelmed me. I put number 2 Bird Boy in charge of the flight and went down for a treetop reconnaissance of Waverly. I was an experienced fighter pilot with 500 flight hours, still alive, and on my first trip home. I buzzed Waverly at 250 miles per hour and left Waverly streets full of people. The population had risen to 1,318 in 1940, staring up at the sky as the tree tops thrashed and whipped from my P-40. That was 50-odd years ago. Occasional comments about that visit still surface from mature Waverly natives. At the time of our marriage, we were planning a honeymoon trip to Haiti to visit now Colonel George Hatton Weems, who was chief of the U.S. military mission to Haiti. Uncle Colonel had large quarters, a cook and servants. Instead, we took the standard Pacific side honeymoon trip, going by train to the Atlantic side and spending 3 days in a hotel, after I picked up the P-40s in Ohio. The trip was far from the fun Caroline anticipated that a trip to Haiti would have been. Lindy Ellis and me. A short time later, Colonel Ellis was transferred back to the States and, in addition to his daughter, he left his dog, Lindy, with his lieutenant son-in-law to bring when I transferred stateside in a few months. Dogs were not allowed on family transport boats back to the States. Caroline warned me that Lindy was a very important person, VIP, in the Ellis family. When I received orders for Luke Airfield, Arizona, in October 1941, special procedures were required to handle Lindy. I tied him to a post at our then emptied quarters and put Caroline aboard a military transport boat on the Pacific side of the canal headed for the Atlantic side. The transport still didn't allow dogs. I picked up Lindy at the apartment and stuffed him into a GI bag. With my good friend Lieutenant Clint Wassam, we checked out an A-10 airplane, and with Lindy on my lap in an open-cockpit 2-seater aircraft, we flew across the Isthmus of Panama to France Field on the Atlantic side of the canal. I could tell Lindy approved of me letting his head out of the bag after we were airborne, but that clearly was the last pleasant thought he had about me or anything else until we were back on the ground. The newly appointed CO of France Field was Major Arthur Bump, late of Albrook Field. We had a party. It was restrained because Wassam and the airplane had to return to Albrook Field the next day in good order. The next morning, Lindy boarded the banana boat and I joined Caroline on the Army boat for our trip back to the States. Caroline was pregnant and sick every hour of every day of the week on that boat. When we got to New Orleans, we unexpectedly had to wait 3 days for Lindy's banana boat to come in. That probably was Lindy's doing. We visited Colonel Ellis for a short spell in Denver, Colorado, and then traveled on to Luke Field near Phoenix for my new station. The truth be told, I knew Lindy was not number 1 on the colonel's list, but he outranked me. War in Southern California. Luke Field was an airfield under construction to train fighter pilots and, in the years to come, gained the reputation as the home of Army Air Corps fighter pilots. We had to work out of tents on the edge of a very large concrete landing mat in between areas still under construction. We received student pilots from other schools. Topped them off with 2 months finishing school in the AT-6 aircraft, an advanced trainer, commissioned them as second lieutenants, and passed them on to specialized aircraft and mission training. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, just a few weeks after we arrived in Arizona, immediately caused a great deal of confusion. There was concern that the invasion of the West Coast might be imminent. Along with a number of other pilots from other airfields who had varying degrees of experience, I rushed west to March Airfield, California, to defend our nation, Special Orders No. 158. It was an exercise so much like the rush to defend Panama that it was scary. But this time, we didn't take airplanes. Colonel Ellis came to Luke Field, gathered up his pregnant baby daughter, and took her back to Denver. An endless stream of rumors surfaced about California. The Japanese were shelling the coastal areas as a prelude to invasion, or Japanese Americans were forming militias in the back country. Blackout was proclaimed for the entire area, but it had little effect because people were allowed to use car lights to get to and from wherever they were going to be blacked out. I was billeted with Major Robert L. Scott, later renowned for his book God is My Co-Pilot that he wrote about his experiences in China. I was the closest thing to a co-pilot he had in California. We, a disorganized mass of individuals, eager to defend our nation, descended upon the March Airfield Operations Officer. We learned startling facts: no one was expecting us, and we had no airplanes to fly, no organization to report to, and nothing to do, except to stay the hell out of other people's way. After all, they had a war to fight. Later, in the officers' club bar, we organized an unidentified unit with Major Scott, commanding, and Lieutenant Sladen, adjutant. I collected a list of 20 or 30 of our names, long since lost. We located a hangar with P-40s down for maintenance, and we gave fellow pilots not checked out in that new combat aircraft cockpit familiarity sessions. That was the sum total of our contribution to the war in Southern California. We hung around the officers' club bar for 2 weeks and were ordered back to our home bases. So much for my second dash forward to defend my country. But it could have been worse. Major General Herbert Darg, my former CO in Panama, fell December 12 in an airplane crash in the Sierra Nevada mountains with several of his staff officers. They were en route from Washington, D.C., to Hawaii via California. I could have been part of his staff. Defense of Arizona and training fighter pilots. Back at Luke Field, our war effort stepped up to a 7-day week, but until the student supply system cranked out more trainees, we hunted for work. I got leave to bring Caroline back from Denver and set up housekeeping again. For weeks after returning from California, I was assigned the mission of defending Arizona on orders from Washington. I qualified for the mission by not yet being embedded in the training structure. The orders implied the probability that the Japanese would land in Southern California and launch an attack on Washington, D.C., through Arizona. Washington recognized we were not equipped or prepared to defend under such combat conditions but expected that every little bit would help. We certainly had that little bit for Washington. The defend order was vague and our ability minimal. With 6 trainers, 2.30 caliber machine guns each, we could cover the aerial approaches to western Arizona. After several futile efforts to devise a plan, we settled on the one feasible one: warn Washington of the Japanese invasion, assuming, of course, that Washington had not already heard California had fallen. Flying back and forth repetitively across a 6-mile stretch of air corridors over the middle of the Arizona desert during daylight hours was not an inspirational activity. However, we did learn that it was quite a thrill, to say the least, if you flew a few feet above the desert floor over the Grand Canyon, which dropped away 1 mile deep suddenly and then, just as suddenly, closed to a few feet above the desert floor on the other side. I flew that several times as did others, but our commander stopped that practice when one pilot misjudged the other side and plowed his airplane into the far wall of the canyon. After a spell of patrolling for invading Japanese in Arizona, a far-sighted Washington bureaucrat shut such activity down. Once again, I was tapped to fly a plane to my unit. A request went out for a pilot qualified to fly an A-10 to the East Coast and pick up an AT-6 for Luke Airfield. It just so happened that my 2 brothers, Lieutenant Al of the Navy and Lieutenant Bill of the Army, were stationed in Washington, D.C., and my flight was over Waverly. I had experience in an A-10, I had flown across Panama in one with a dog on my lap. I got the mission. Flying the A-10 from Luke to Albuquerque, New Mexico, was no problem. Aircraft of the 1940s were birds of a feather, subservient to the Gump checklist, or almost. In the air over Albuquerque, getting ready to land, I applied the Gump checklist, but nothing in the cockpit told me the landing gear was down and locked. But nothing said it wasn't. From a pilot's perspective, airplane instruments need to be more positive than that. After all, I already had an emergency landing in Panama and destroyed an airplane because of a landing gear problem. Nothing told me my landing gears were down. I came back to the tower, flew by low and requested a visual check of the gears, which the tower reported looked okay. But just in case, the tower alerted fire engines to come to the runway for possible landing problems. I had none. The rest of the flight was more positive, because an A-10 crew chief in Albuquerque pointed out a thumb-like gizmo from the wheel well that popped up through a hole in the top of the wing outside the cockpit, verifying for the pilot that the wheels were down and locked. I had a memorable time with my Navy and Army brothers in D.C. and was careful to recover from my hangover before flying the AT-6 back to Arizona. My flight over Waverly? I was now a settled married man about to become a father, and the Air Corps had forbidden buzzing hometowns. At Luke Field, I commanded a training squadron in the Air Corps' Advanced Flying School for a short time and then became Assistant Director of Training under Lieutenant Colonel Lester S. Harris, Director of Training. We were part of the new 37th Flying Training Wing, also at Luke Field. For almost 3 years, the Harris-Sladen team squeezed more training into more fighter cadets in less time with each passing month. We daily monitored more than 250 training planes, each with an instructor and student, in the skies over a large section of central Arizona. The first year, we trained pilots every day all day and well into the night. We were continually reminded by the powers above that wars don't wait. That was the beginning of Luke Field as the home of fighter pilots in World War II. Our daughter, Caroline Weems Sladen, nicknamed the Gremlin, arrived on schedule on March 30, 1942 in Phoenix. I don't remember what the Gremlin cost, but she was the most expensive of our children. The next 3 arrived in military hospitals at an average of $12 each, and most of that expense was for Caroline's food. The year 1942 must have been one of chaos in Washington, D.C., when they realized they were getting a burgeoning wartime army on hand with not enough people in charge. I was a first lieutenant and senior by the time the war started, having been promoted to second lieutenant, the first time, in the Infantry Reserve in 1935. So the Army Air Corps promoted me 3 ranks in 11 months. I became a captain in February 1942, a major in May 1942, and a lieutenant colonel in January 1943. In 1943, the shock of war subsided or, possibly, we had become very proficient at outputting trained pilots at Luke Field. Regardless, the stream of flying cadets was reduced and so was our workweek by 1 day. In the spare time produced by a 6-day workweek, I began looking for gold in the Arizona desert. I received a report that Lieutenant William W. Roberts, one of my flying instructors, was trying to put together time to get married. When his leave request came to me for approval, he also mentioned that his bride-to-be had an uncle who had a map to the legendary Lost Dutchman's gold mine in the nearby Superstition Mountains. 5 days were immediately put together for Robert's wedding, 2 more than the wartime allotment, with the understanding that he was to bring back a copy of the map along with his bride. He did. Thus began my and, later, my family's wandering around with me in the Superstition Mountains off and on over decades, looking for the Dutchman's lost stash of gold. Fort Leavenworth and the Fighting Weemses. After 3 years of training other pilots for World War II, I attended advanced training before reporting to a fighter group headed for Europe. I was ordered to the Army Command and Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, for several weeks to learn how the Army worked. By this time, I was a major and older brother Bill was a captain and an instructor at the school. Captain Sladen carried Major Sladen's bags into my student apartment. I was youngest of the 3 Sladen brothers in the war effort and the last of the 3 to enter military service. Oldest brother, Al, an Annapolis graduate, brother Bill, an armor officer in the Army, and I were in friendly competition to see who attained rank the fastest. I was winning, at least for the moment. I also routinely won another family competition, the brother who was the baldest. Throughout our adult lives, we three lowered our heads for photographs to document the baldest as the winner, or as in this case, me, the loser. In January 1943, Bill, still at Fort Leavenworth, created and served as first editor of Weemsana, a family newsletter named after our mother's family, Weems, published 4 times a year. Its purpose was to maintain contact among the children, spouses and grandchildren of Tennesseans Joseph Birch and Bessie Rye Weems serving in the war effort. Joe B. and Bessie were our grandparents. When Bill, then a lieutenant colonel, left for war, Aunt Docky, ship, Weems became the editor for the January 1, 1944 edition. Brother Al, a Navy commander, was already out to sea, location unknown. Weemsana and the Fighting Weemses received national attention from Time Life. An excerpt from Time views the news, Blue Network radio broadcast, November 2, 1944, and now we are going to take a couple of minutes to tell you about one of the fightingest American families there is. The Weemses of Tennessee. They have so many family members in the armed services that they publish a family newspaper about themselves every couple of months. A nice little tabloid called Weemsana. Time correspondent William Howland of Atlanta, Georgia, sent us a copy today, and, while we grant you this isn't hot spot news, well anyway, it's good Americana. There are 50 members of the Weems family in service. They have top-notchers and buck privates, and there are WAVs, U.S. Navy's women accepted for volunteer emergency services, and WACs, Women's Army Corps. Among these top-notchers are Brigadier General George Hatton Weems, who is Assistant Commandant of the Infantry School, and over in London, a Major Mary C. Weems has charge of WAC personnel in the London area. In Dixon, Tennessee, is a civilian, Mrs. Docky Weems, who edits this novel newspaper all devoted to the doings of one highly military family. The family paper seldom refers to anybody by the last name, it is always Mary Kate, or Susie or something like that. As correspondent Howland said, the paper is as homey as the aroma of frying sausage from a Weems kitchen in Tennessee. Back in the days of 1861 or thereabouts, Joseph Birch Weems of Tennessee joined the scouts of General Nathan Bedford Forrest. General Forrest was the one who said, "Get there fustest with the mostest." Well, ever since, whenever there is a war, the Weemses try to get there the fustest with the mostest. It is of note that Weemsana is still being published, 2020, but only once a year. It is the official magazine of the Weems Educational Fund, headquartered in Waverly, that was established on January 1, 1939 and endowed by the estate of my bachelor uncle General, George Hatton Weems, at his passed away in 1957. The fund provides college scholarships for needy, worthy, and deserving students, and for other educational projects, primarily in the 3 Tennessee counties from which Joe B. and Bessie Weems hailed. I went from the school at Fort Leavenworth to Georgia for a couple of months of upgraded combat training with the 59th Fighter Group to help prepare me for war. I had orders to the 48th Fighter Bomber Group at Walterboro Army Airfield, South Carolina, a unit headed for World War II. To prepare for deployment, I received a memo from the Walterboro CO, dated January 27, 1944, checklist for individual replacements for overseas movement. A list of clothing, equipment and documents, both personal and issue, required for combat deployment, see Annex 6 on page 114. At the 48th Fighter Bomber Group, I was second in command under Lieutenant Colonel Dixon M. Allison. Caroline, with child number 2, more or less halfway ready to be born, and I farmed out the gremlin, almost 2 years old, with my retired in-laws in Avon Park, Florida, and moved to Walterboro Airfield. We lived a soldier's camp follower's life in a newfangled motel in South Carolina for weeks until I departed for Europe. At Walterboro, the 48th trained initially on the P-39 Airacobra fighter. It was a special plane, but not in ways pilots had in mind. The engine had been moved to the rear of the cockpit, and a long crankshaft led to the propeller up front. This allowed a 37mm cannon to be installed and fired through the hub of the propeller. However, the long crankshaft made thumping noises, and the engine weight shifted to the rear created instability. At times, the plane sort of grabbed the bit in its teeth. No one complained when thousands were sent to Russia in Lend-Lease, even though slightly improved. One upgraded fighter airplane we had in South Carolina was the P-43 King Cobra. Among other improvements, it took the P out of gump by automatically controlling the propeller machinery. Fiery crash, fifth and final. I flew the P-63 one unusually warm winter day at the end of January on a high-altitude training mission, which was not bad now that my tonsils were protected by an oxygen mask. But at 15,000 feet, my propeller started revving erratically. The noise rapidly increased until suddenly there was a loud thump, and the propeller stopped. Smoke was in the cockpit. I adjusted for fire hazard, picked out a suitable field in which to land, circled to a proper altitude, and made a right-angle turn into a landing approach, in this case, wheels up because South Carolina in the warm weather had become a muddy mess. Then the fire in back burned through the firewall into my cockpit. I changed my procedures and headed directly toward the ground, arriving too fast to land but leaving enough speed to bounce up over a grove of trees at the end of the field. I drove that airplane into the next field as if I were shooting an arrow. That's not in the books, but it worked fine in the South Carolina mud. To exit the P-63 you had to open a door, it didn't have a canopy. Above the door was a big yellow lever marked, emergency, that you pulled to shove the entire door out of the way quickly. I pulled and shoved. Nothing happened. With fire licking the back of my neck, I reared back and charged the door with all my strength, knocking it away from the aircraft and throwing myself out of the cockpit and across the wing to skid headfirst into the muddy field. In the process, I ground dirt into my burned wrists. My wrists between the uniform sleeves and flying gloves had fourth-degree burns as well as the back of my neck between my uniform and leather helmet. Belly landing a burning fighter plane into a crop field in rural South Carolina in 1944 quickly drew a crowd. One kind lady brought a big dish of home-churned, unsalted butter from the nearest farmhouse and smeared it on my burned places to try to calm the pain. I asked the first driver I saw to take me to Walterboro Fields Hospital. He was a feed and seed salesman making his rounds. He stopped twice to tell people who I was, what just happened, and that he was taking me to the hospital. I politely requested he just drive straight to the hospital. When we arrived, the Walterboro emergency room was on high alert. One of their senior pilots had gone down somewhere and was missing. A glance from a medic at my burned flight suit smeared in mud, blood, and butter, and the next thing I knew I was on my back with needles in me. Later, the doctor picked out the obvious sticks and rocks in my wrists and decided not to dig around any farther in the wounds. He bandaged over the whole mess. The wounds never became infected. Over the years, pieces of South Carolina worked their way up near the skin on my wrists, causing unusual lumps. My children found that especially fascinating. On 2 occasions, doctors split the skin and removed pieces of South Carolina. That must have been good soil because I never had a problem with it. After 2 weeks in the hospital, I took Mary Caroline back to Avon Park to stay with my in-laws and the gremlin for the duration. I then departed for the European theater with bandages covering tender parts.